Welcome to Rising Stronger, preparing Canada's post-pandemic workforce. My name is Kelly Hoey, and I'm delighted to be here to get things going this morning. We have a large and varied group of stakeholders who have joined us today. This leadership forum has been convened by Workforce Central Canada, and it's a collaboration of MDB Insight, the National Association of Workforce Boards, and HIAC. Workforce Central Canada is a collaborative space where we can work together on a shared vision for workforce development, a vision for Canada's future. Today, we've assembled a panel of thought leaders and friends to begin a conversation about the unprecedented circumstances that are unfolding and that will ultimately define Canada's post-pandemic labor market. I'm pleased to be a founding member, a founding partner in Workforce Central Canada, and my job is really just to set the stage. We have upwards of 500 people who are entering this room. So that is just a fantastic turnout. We are delighted. We want you to know that we will do our best to answer all your questions and to view your comments. And note that the webinar will be available at workforcecentralcanada.org. Shortly following this session, you can continue to ask questions through the Zoom chat feature on your screen. We have a Twitter account. We have our ask at workforcecentral.ca. And so we will continue to keep this conversation going. And here to help us today with that discussion is our moderator, Ron Painter. Ron is the CEO of the National Association of Workforce Boards. Ron is recognized for his knowledge, insight, and passion for all things workforce. He brings that expertise today as we tackle the many questions we all have on our minds. So thanks for working with us, Ron. I'll hand it over to you.
All right, and thank you, Kelly. It is a pleasure to be here, and it's I do a podcast. It's always fun to have friends on that podcast, people that you know and the people you have high respect for. And I have to tell all of everybody who is joining that we have a panel of people that a smart panel and I think a really lively conversation ahead of us. We all know that we're in the midst of a global pandemic, and that pandemic has wiped out about 6.7% of the working hours across the world, and that amounts to about 195 million of those jobs, basically, if you count up those hours across the world. So we're seeing something that basically I think is unprecedented, but I know Stephen Tobin's with us, and he's going to talk about give us an idea of what we're looking at. April 2020 saw Canada's largest ever monthly decline in employment. There's lots to consider as we look ahead and determine how people and how we as institutions and as leaders in workforce development are going to help people come back and help people get into the future. As Kelly mentioned, for those of you who have asked questions already, we're gonna try to get to those. You're seeing us live. When we leave the live, we're gonna hang out as the panel together and talk about some of the questions we didn't get a chance to answer, and maybe talk a little bit more in detail about questions that we just didn't have time to fully answer. So let me introduce you very quickly to the panel, and then what we're going to do is I'm going to have them tell you a little bit about the organization that they are with. So it's a pleasure for me to, I'll just introduce them all, and then we'll walk down through. So I want to introduce the panel today is Stephen Tobin, who is the Executive Director of Labor Market Information Council. He's a member of the Advisory Committee on Labor and Income Statistics for Statistics Canada, which I'm sure if you're a data person, you totally appreciate. I do. He's Vice President of the Ottawa Economics Association and holds a graduate degree from the University of Victoria. Trudy Parsons is the Executive Vice President of MDB Insight and a great partner to me and to those of us at NAWB. She is a member of the Economic Developers Council of Ottawa and holds a graduate MBA degree. Gladys Okine is the executive lead for the Canadian Council for Youth Prosperity, which is a really important demographic in all of this. She is formerly the executive director for First Work, and prior to that was with Goodwill Industries of Toronto. She holds a degree from the University of Toronto and an MBA from the University of Phoenix. Sarah Watts-Rynard is the CEO for Polytechnics Canada, and she was formerly the executive director for the Canadian Apprenticeship Forum and the director of communications for Textiles HR Council. And Sarah is a graduate of Carleton University, and I know we're going to get to it, but I think apprenticeship and the whole notion of work-based learning, I think are an interesting part of this mix. Last and certainly not least, Jake Hirsch-Allen, who is the North American Workforce and Higher Education System lead for LinkedIn. Prior to that, his career at LinkedIn has been as the lead for the Economic Graph and Learning Solutions. He is a partner in Lighthouse Labs. And interestingly, Vice President for International Council on Badges and Credentials. And Jake, I hope we can get a little time to get into that, because I know that that's a world that you are teaching me what all of that means, and I hope we have time for that. He is a graduate of the University van Amsterdam and has a law degree from McGill University. So that's your panel today. And I'm going to start right off. And Stephen, I'm going to turn this over to you and ask you to talk a little bit about the Labor Market Information Council and some of your work and the reach of your work.
Thanks, Ron. Pleasure to be here. I mean, to keep it really kind of simple, the Labor Market Information Council is not-for-profit, pan-Canadian in nature, whose sort of board is made up of the provinces and territories, federal government, Statistics Canada. And really, to kind of put it simple, we are tasked with providing Canadians, I would say, unbiased, objective sort of data and insights that helps them really kind of navigate what is an extremely complex world of work.
Jake, talk a little bit about your role at LinkedIn and the organization LinkedIn Learning, if people don't already know LinkedIn Learning.
Absolutely, happy to. So my role is quite specific. I run workforce development and higher education systems for LinkedIn Learning across North America. And I focused prior to that on Canada's higher education system. And so it's really the intersection of higher education, workforce development, online learning, which we are now the world leader in, and labor market information. That is where I spend most of my time supporting organizations like those on the phone in how they can leverage our data and our content to undertake training either for higher ed or workforce development purposes.
And I had the pleasure recently, Jake, of interviewing former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, Tony Watson. And one of the things that you mentioned, you're the lead on North America. And one of the things that he really stressed to me was we don't talk enough about North America in terms of this whole business around the impact. Stephen's going to talk about the numbers, but the impact and also the learning that has to go with that. So I hope maybe in the follow-up we get a chance to talk about that. Sarah, the Polytechnics, talk a little bit about the mission and your role with the organization.
Sure, thanks. So Polytechnics Canada is a national association. We represent 13 Polytechnic institutes across Canada. I'm their CEO. Our role is to speak to the value of an applied and industry-focused education, which is what our members are offering. So they're offering a breadth of credentials, everything from 4-year bachelor degrees to diplomas, apprenticeship training, and continuing education. I think the key differentiation with a polytechnic education is that direct connection with industry, essentially making polytechnics on the ground solution providers, trying to support smooth school to work transitions for students, and pivoting at the speed of business to respond to new and emerging challenges, which obviously we're in the middle of one of those right now. So if we look around at the people that we've really most relied on during the last 2 months or so, nurses and personal support workers, those in construction and manufacturing, first responders, many of them are developing their skills at our institutions. And my organization is really tasked to talking about that impact with government and with decision makers here in Ottawa.
Wow, and for those of our viewers in the States, Polytechnics would probably translate to their community colleges? Pretty close?
Probably a little bit more on the technical and applied side, but definitely, yes, within the college sector, that's their place.
Okay. And Gladys, tell us a little bit about the Canadian Council for Youth Prosperity.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So CCYP, as we call it, is a relatively new organization, but it's been forming in the works over the last 2 years. We are a coalition of influencers on the workforce development space who are all concerned and invested in advancing youth employment and youth workforce development, but oftentimes don't have the opportunity to combine efforts and resources in order to ensure longer term results and impacts for young people. And so that's what we're committed to doing. We are also a national organization, and so looking at what interventions and opportunities can be presented right across the country to make sure we have a really robust ecosystem supporting Canadian youth holistically.
Great, and as I mentioned, a really critical constituency as we talk through this conversation. And last but not least, Trudy, do you want to say hello and tell us a little bit about MDB Insight?
Certainly, thanks, Ron, and thanks everyone so much for joining us today. So MDB Insight is a national economic development consultancy that houses a national workforce development division. We offer, we do a lot of work in cultural development, market research, sort of tying together all of the key elements of linking economic and workforce development together. And we've had the privilege of doing this across Canada, into the US and internationally. Building strategies, working with communities to really tackle the whole supply and demand alignment. And so I'm thrilled to be a part of the panel today along with my fellow panelists, and recognizing the connection and intersection points of the work that we're all doing.
I was going to say, you get to help those of us on the workforce side wander through the world of economic development and try to understand our colleagues over there. All right,
Absolutely.
Thanks. Stephen, let me get right to it. I mentioned the number out of The Guardian that said, man, this is like 195 million jobs worldwide. We are setting people's hours back. Take us, and looking at the industries hardest hit, but take us through the numbers that we're seeing in Canadian unemployment and the job losses.
Right. So, I mean, as some of you may be aware, last Friday was when Statistics Canada sort of released the numbers for April. And, those who know me know that I'm not one to sort of speak in hyperboles, but when you look at sort of what transpired in March and April, essentially the Canadian economy shed some 3 million jobs in those 2 months alone, right? Now, okay, what does 3 million mean, right? To anyone, the US lost 20 million in April as well, right? But for Canada to think about what that 3 million sort of translates into, it's actually more jobs than we've lost in any of the past 3 recessions combined, right? And we've lost those jobs in 2 months.
Wait, say that again. It is more lost in the last couple months than in the 3 previous recessions combined?
Correct. Yeah. And obviously in a much faster time frame, right? So now, the good news, if there is one, it's what I'm calling a bronze lining, if you will, is that we have this sort of situation in Canada where you can have sort of a temporary separation from your employment, right? So the bulk of the increase in unemployment has been temporary. So that connection to the employer is still there for many. But the question, of course, is, how long we'll be in this situation and the extent to which, those people will be able to return to their jobs and they'll still be waiting for them, right? But really, in context, to think that in 2 months alone, we've lost more than the 3 recessions combined is quite a stark reminder of the size and magnitude of what we're seeing.
Stephen, were there vulnerabilities? I've been hanging out a wee bit with Dun & Bradstreet and looking at some numbers going into the pandemic. Were there some weaknesses in the economy prior to the pandemic, and maybe it accelerates what we would have seen over a longer span?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots and lots of vulnerabilities, I think, that have either kind of cracked open or are new. But when I think about the job losses, and you look at the 3 million people who really have gone from employed to unemployed, I think what kind of concerns me the most in thinking about the vulnerability and how we think about constructing kind of an employment recovery is that much of those job losses have been among, let's say, vulnerable populations, right? So we know that a big chunk of the job losses have been principally among low-wage workers, right? So those who are already sort of scraping by, many of which are women or youth. And so it's unlike, the 2008, 2009 crisis in that respect, right? And so I think when we think about the vulnerabilities, I think about those populations or sociodemographics. And that's something I think that we need to really bear in mind when we think about how we construct a recovery, because how we previously may have constructed recovery, such as infrastructure investment, might not actually speak to addressing and helping these particular populations participate in sort of an inclusive recovery, if you will.
Jake, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what was and maybe what is. I'm going to ask you, first of all, LinkedIn Learning and LinkedIn, you have millions of us that have our profile up there in terms of occupations and skills. So what were you all seeing in terms of skills that were on the rise prior to COVID-19, and what kind of occupations were those in, or industry?
I mean, before and at the most aggregate level, it actually looked quite similar to now, which is to say the most important skills are both the foundational human skills, and these really haven't changed a lot, I would argue, over human history, let alone over the past 3 to 6 months. So we're talking about leadership and management. I'm literally reading through the list for North America right now. Creative problem solving and design thinking and communication were ranked both by our data on the quantitative side and on the qualitative side as the most highly ranked skills by managers for their new hires and employees, and then also by those employees when they were looking to develop their own skills. And so on the foundational human side, it really hasn't changed at all. On the technical side, obviously, with digital literacy adapting every week, it's changed a fair bit. And I think what we've really seen is a huge emphasis on remote work. So for the 30% or so of the economy, which probably represents the less or the more advantaged, the less disadvantaged, to reference Stephen's numbers, percent of the population, those 30% who are learning to work remote and who are able to work remote are learning new skills in rapid fire sequence. Even just, all of us have to navigate 15 different video
I was just going to say, Nathan and the crew are trying to teach me more technology skills.
Precisely. I was on an email chain earlier this morning where somebody offered 4 different platforms, and then of course the invitation came in a 5th platform, right? So it was Teams and Zoom and FaceTime and who knows what else, Google Hangouts. But the point being, we are all having to learn a lot really fast, and yet the foundational human skills, let me add one or two to the list that I read before. When you think about resilience, right? When you think about adaptability, all of us are having to implement that in real time. When you think about how a restaurant has to go from selling in person with a staff of 20 to selling online with a staff of 3 and learn to navigate government stimuli, et cetera. It's those kinds of human skills that I think are really being tried at the foremost. And in particular, it's the fact that we're now looking at how individuals are applying that adaptability to a setting that is probably more different than life in their lives that they've ever seen. And that's, again, to reference what Stephen's describing. No previous recession could prepare us for the changes that this pandemic have brought. It's that adaptability that's key. If one starts to look at technical skills, and maybe I'll jump to your second question, the after piece, which is to say, the technical skills are really specific to different industries and different places. So my favorite example from the world of workforce development, everybody needs COBOL now, right? This ancient IBM computing language that everybody thought didn't exist anymore, except that so many government mainframes are running on it that when half of the US unemployment insurance system came down a few weeks ago, part of that was because the technology it's built on is actually a really old IT technology that's now hyper in demand. That's a really niche tech, but I think there's a variety of others that are also more widely important. Obviously, personal support workers in healthcare, there's massive demand, supply chain management, et cetera.
Yeah, I'm reminded that Andrew Yang, who came out of the former tech executives, said we are going to learn more in 10 weeks than we may have had to learn in 10 years. We're going to have to be that adaptive. Let me ask you another question. Again, you're very involved in the international conversations around badges and credentials. This isn't the COVID-19, the pandemic isn't inventing the need for, or this hunt for competencies, but this is really taken on great priority, right, in establishing badges and credentials across the world. That pace is going to keep going?
Yeah, it's definitely going to keep going. And not only is the pace going to keep going, but I'm hoping that we're going to reach a greater degree of standardization and interoperability. So here I want to distinguish between the various different roles that I have. Obviously, I work for LinkedIn, and so everybody can feel free to add me on LinkedIn. Just let me know you attended this event afterwards. But that's my core job. But the perspective that I speak from actually varies depending on the organization that I'm associated with. So I also founded originally in-person software development boot camp that's now entirely online. And sometimes I speak from that private career college's perspective. In the case of this question, I'll speak from the perspective of the International Council on Badges and Credentials, because their view is actually very, very macro. It's that all forms of recognition should now be enabled by technology. And ideally, we should have that technology be interoperable between the post-secondary, the workforce development, the employment, and the government setting, so that everybody understands what skills an individual is learning from a given experience, what competencies they've gained from a given classroom. And if we can come up with that degree of standardization, it's going to make people like Stephen's job a lot easier when they're trying to figure out what folks are learning or what's required for a job, because right now it's actually a communication problem. Everybody's using different languages, in this case, the language of different credentials or badges, in order to signify different skills.
So the message to the job seeker and to the training provider is, if you're not having conversations with business, you better get deep in those conversations, because you need to know what's that competency and what's the, I guess, the badge or the credential that they're going to recognize as that competency.
Yeah, I'd almost say doing 3 things, and this goes way beyond what the average person does in terms of how they represent their own skills. But on the employee side, or on the person looking for employment, the key is to do 3 things. 1, LinkedIn is where people tend to look, and if you put your name in Google, one of the social networks is likely going to pop up in among the top hits for anybody who's on any of those networks because of search optimization. So ensure that those skills are represented on your LinkedIn profile, but also have some form of backpack. There's all sorts of Credential Engine and Concentric Sky and dozens of other companies, Badger and Acclaim, all have their own badging initiatives. Thankfully, everybody I just mentioned is interoperable. So use the LinkedIn one, which is not. Use one of those, which are all basically interoperable, and most post-secondaries will actually be able to give you some recognition for whatever you're getting from, say, one of Sarah's members at Polytechnics Canada, in the form of a badge or credential represented on one of those platforms. And then the last part is have a portfolio as well. Demonstrate your skills and ability through the actual work products that you've worked on over the years.
And for the employer, is this a matter of that job description or position description you've been using for the last decade? You need to go back in there and start to articulate better. What's the competency embedded in that?
Exactly. Look at some of the standards, look at how people are representing their skills, and then try to match your description to those.
Ron,
So for the workforce intermediary out there, and I guess it's a question for you, Trudy, to start. For the workforce intermediary out there, workforce or economic development, helping the employer translate is a key task, right?
and it's a significant challenge because, you know, one of the things that we recognize, and I'm sure most on the call as well, is that, you know, the majority of the businesses in our communities are those small to medium-sized employers. And they are the salesperson, they're the marketing person, they're the finance person, and they're the HR person. And so, you know, creating job descriptions or creating a job posting is not a simple task. And it's generally fit in, you know, at, you know, between, you know, 9 and 10 p.m. at night, you know, before they head off to bed to realize, oh, I need to get this posting out, you know, first thing in the morning. And that's the reality that our small businesses face. A lot of them do not have an HR department where they can support that work. And so it's a real shift in the conversation that we need to be having with employers to provide that concierge service or support system that actually helps them to take everything that Jake just talked about and make sense of what does that mean for me as an employer looking to fill a job vacancy for a new office manager, because they're not necessarily making that connection.
Trudy, you mentioned small business, and in many communities across Canada, across the States as well, small business is the backbone of that community. How does the pandemic impact economic development plans in your view going forward? What are the kind of things you're going to be looking at maybe differently or in more detail than you were?
Well, I think first and foremost, the pandemic has really accelerated the need for communities to amplify economic development planning. You know, while it's a priority on many, if not all, municipalities, it is so in various degrees and varying ways. And when I think about, you know, economic downturns, or we think about natural disasters that have taken place in the past, you know, it's generally folks within that economic development profession that are first out the gate. They're first out to have those conversations with those employers in their communities. They're looking for solutions. They're bringing partnerships together. They're informing policy. They're informing funding opportunities. They're really on the ground, knees deep in what's the issue and how do we find a solution to help our businesses. And to your point, you know, most of these businesses are small to medium. I think of, you know, rural downtown communities. And for, you know, I live in a small community of about 8,000 people. And for us to lose 2 stores in our downtown is detrimental. So imagine communities where they're losing 6, 8, 10, 20, 50 stores in a downtown, or just in the community in general. So we're starting to see and seeing some really positive outreach or results from discussions with municipalities that there is definitely a clear recognition. You know, many of them are forming, you know, advisory, economic recovery committees and task forces. They're bringing people together to say, what does this look like in my community? How do we respond to this in our community? How do we support our businesses? And, you know, one of the concerns always is, of course, the financial impact of COVID on these business, not just on the business, but on the municipality in general. You know, municipalities are reducing property taxes, whether delaying or reducing. Other sources of revenue that they've generally had coming in are now not coming in. Rec centers are closed. They're not getting that funding. So, you know, what's the financial implication to the municipality? And how does the municipality position itself to still be responsive to the creation or revision to that economic development strategy that they either do not have, or maybe they've just completed it?
You mentioned that. I know the federal government has responded with, I think the project is, the acronym is LEAF, which I can't remember the total acronym, but I know it's an outreach to large employers. There's also, I know income taxes are delayed, later in the year. But we don't often think about the impact on the municipality. And does this also highlight the fact that you're not going to do this planning in a silo, that you really got to think about workforce development, economic development investments, housing, transportation, childcare, all of that's got to be wrapped together.
100%. And what comes to my mind, Ron, is understanding what the impact has been directly to the business. So we just recently, like in the past few days, been doing some analysis for a particular community. They saw about 23% of their businesses actually saw an increase in revenue since COVID. And they're actually having a challenge finding people to do the jobs that they need to do. On the reverse side of that, about 60% of them have had to look at their staff and do those layoffs that, both Stephen and Jake referenced. And, that's across all different spectrums of skill level. And so, what keeps me awake at night is how do we do a better job of supporting our municipalities to understand who are the folks that they need to be connecting to, how do they make those connections, and what are the key questions that they really need to be focusing on. So things like, BR&E, business expansion and retention, very common across any municipality within the economic development space. Looking at labor market information and understanding, what does this 13.7% unemployment rate mean to me and to my business? Understanding how to reallocate dollars perhaps away from foreign direct investment or brownfield development and moving that into, core economic development at the local level to help businesses, number one, survive, but number two, to expand and to be able to continue to do business in whatever the new norm actually looks like.
So that's a great question, and I'll forewarn everybody. I'm going to come back and ask them what keeps them up at night. People used to ask me, what do I think about at 30,000 feet in the air? And the answer is, I don't think anything about that anymore because I'm not in the air. But Sarah, I want to come to you because I'm not saying all eyes are on the Polytechnics, but I mean, to Jake's point that this is accelerated. That whole new world that we kept talking about, that future of work, part of that has really arrived now. And so it's not just the people who have lost employment, it's going to be incumbent workers. The whole landscape has changed. I know that the Polytechnics were working on e-learning and prior skills. How has this accelerated that? How are you all preparing?
I think that Polytechnic institutes tend to be a pretty innovative bunch. So they have been working for a number of years on e-learning, blended learning, simulation-based learning models, really across the board and through all of the programs that they're looking at. But like most post-secondary institutions, they had to react quickly to get students off campus. That was I'd say student feedback has said that actually was pretty successful, considering the panic that was required to do it in lots of cases. And many students across the country finished their last semester online. But online learning is an imperfect solution. And so it really doesn't recognize the needs of tactile learners. It doesn't allow for practical or lab work. It doesn't provide those critical feedback loops. And I think that is really what is, that's critical in so many occupations. And when I think, when I hear, Trudy talking about, what businesses are going through, a polytechnic education is industry focused. So it's supposed to be responding precisely to what the industry demand looks like. And I don't think that we want a nurse or a veterinary technician to be taking blood after they learned about it online.
Yeah.
You know, we don't want them just watching demonstrations. We want them doing that kind of work hands-on. And I think we'd feel the same about a mechanic working on our brakes, having never held the wrench, you know. So that's the kind of, I think that's the kind of challenge ahead. While the move was to online, and the thinking about was how to use what we know about online learning and blended learning and simulations and put those into practice. We've got to say that technology, whether it's virtual and augmented reality, illustrations, animations, simulators, they are part of the solution, but they are not the whole solution. And that's, we have to be real about that. You know, there's considerable limitations when it comes to developing both competency and confidence in applied and technical fields of study. So I would say that the current situation has really only made that more real, and shown the limitations that we've got to work around in this new reality.
So is it safe to say that really the polytechnics, more so than others, have to rethink like how we learn, how we teach? Teaching has to change, correct? I mean, I was adjunct faculty. I'm sure people were very bored listening to the introduction to the process of public policy, but teaching virtually is different, right? So there's a whole new skill that your colleagues have to agree.
Absolutely. So I'd say that teaching in this space has certainly changed. It was already quite demanding, because offering training that is responsive to industry means not only knowing what industry needs, but also the environment for which you are preparing your students. Instructors often come from industry and they maintain close relationships there. And this is one of their strengths, because it really allows them to not only teach, but become part of their students' professional networks. Such an important part about that smooth labor market transition. The current environment means not only trying to translate what you know for the next generation, but also now doing so in a format that doesn't come as second nature to many instructors, and really doesn't allow for the same degree of interaction, which is really so important. So I think it is being addressed to the degree that it can under the circumstances, but to expect that applied education can move online is, in my view, really undervalues the nature and importance of applied education. So yes, definitely immediate implications. And I think we have to ask ourselves how we offer the same value proposition to our students and to our industry partners in that environment. But I think it's going to require some long-term reckoning about how we as a society think about and value hands-on skills.
And I have friends who have school-age children that are now home, that they're trying to figure out how to teach them via online and in person. So I think you have a whole new cadre of people out there who appreciate how difficult teaching and doing it well is. So, hats off to your crew. Gladys, I want to talk about a population I know very close to your heart, very close to mine as well. This emerging labor force, we know that there's a long-term impact to young people coming into a market that's on the downside. What do you see as the immediate impact for I guess what people refer to as the NEET kids out there, not in employment, education, or training? What's the immediate impact that you see?
Well, the first thing that we're seeing now, and we will continue to see, I think, for at least the next few months, if not longer, depending on how long recovery takes, is deprioritization. They are not going to be the first hired. They're not going to be the ones that are first called back to work. There will be a lot more consideration as to how much training and development they need to be able to access priorities. And so it is going to be a steep uphill climb to continue to connect them to the labor market and support their ability to stay attached to it. That is going to become increasingly difficult. It's already been difficult, but we've made, good strides to create some opportunities that allows for quick touch points along with continued learning and developmental skill development opportunities. But I think those types of things are going to be really, really challenged. And, we're waiting to see what it's going to look like at the provincial level across the country in terms of how resources for employment and service training are going to be repurposed. Whether or not skills development opportunities will be able to maintain the same level of funding, or if resources will be redirected to quick labor attachment interventions to get as many people to work as possible without the supports required to support the retention. So that's something we're really concerned about and want to make sure that whatever plans are developed includes a balance in terms of interventions, as well as the intermediaries who facilitate those interventions to make sure the right supports are in place for young people. But there has been severe disruption, and there will continue to be severe disruption if we don't get better organized around how to address it.
A question came in, and I'm going to give this to you to kind of kick off, and maybe Sarah can jump in as well. I think this is a real concern. In talking to my colleagues in the States, they're dealing with rural youth, rural broadband issues. They're dealing with young people in urban settings who don't have access, or don't have, I guess purely don't have access to online or to that. How do you think, what are you advocating for? What do you think is part of the solution around this issue to access? What do we need to be doing?
So there's a couple of things. Number one, we know that online is not the solution to everything. It simply isn't. It's a great tool and intervention and option where the necessary conditions facilitate that option. So if there is no broadband access, if there is no internet, your clients that you're supporting don't actually have access to computers or laptops or the things that they need to participate, simply moving your services online doesn't solve the problem. And so that is a very real issue that we are contending with right now. For organizations who've been able to relocate and support their staff to be able to work remotely, the question of how to facilitate your clients to be able to access services remotely has been a huge one. And there hasn't been a consistent response across the country around how organizations can facilitate that. Can they use their existing funds to purchase equipment for job seekers? Can they take the equipment from their existing empty employment resource center and lend it out to job seekers so they can use it from home? These are big, they seem really simple, trivial things. Sure, why don't you do that? But it's just not that simple, because there are protocols in place, and you need to get permission, and you need to make sure you don't get slapped on the wrist because you decided to take a publicly funded resource and repurpose it. But these are the types of things that we also need to think about at this current time. Someone's just commenting, we also have so much poverty that computers in the home and the internet is not the priority. There are other competing interests. Couldn't agree with you more. And so we find that agencies are trying to go to philanthropic partners to help offset those costs, so it's not an additional financial burden on the family. But Canada's philanthropy base is nothing like the States. It's very small. It's very small. And funders, I'm talking about private sector funders, they're inundated with requests for cell phones, for cell phone service, for computers, for laptops. And so I think one of the key things we need to do to be able to address this is better coordinate the supports that we need as a sector, and go and approach these potential partners to make sure that we are maximizing access right across the ecosystem, as opposed to these individual requests going forward, because the response level, they just can't handle it. And so it's much easier to go to the partners you're already working with versus figuring out how to address these larger issues. But that doesn't mean that organizations are not trying and partners are not trying to work through these challenges and to facilitate supports. The other thing that as an ecosystem that I think we really need to take into consideration is, what does safe service delivery look like post-pandemic? At some point, our centers are going to open back up. And we won't be able to maintain safe social distancing or safe protocols in many of the current setups of these spaces. You can't have people sitting so close together. You can't fit as many staff into the same space. You may not be able to share equipment the way that you used to. And so there are true, real costs to being able to meet the demands of service delivery post-pandemic that I don't think that we have quite acknowledged yet, and really, really need to seriously think about how are we going to make sure that we are bringing people back to work safely in order to be able to adequately support job seekers going forward. And there are real impacts for those who provide the service. Some will not be able to return to the same service levels that they were at pre-pandemic because there are financial impacts. Some have single sources of funding from private sector partners. And as a result of the pandemic, they're no longer able to provide those resources. And so there are centers that are closing because they're not government funded. They can't operate. They're the only center in their community. And so there are big, broad questions about how do we maintain a certain level of service across the ecosystem, not only for current supports, but how do we support the economy to revive itself and come back online? And young people, and when we talk about youth, we're talking about a broad spectrum of young people, students, young people with disabilities, young women, homeless youth. I mean, we're talking about all young people. They are really, as Stephen mentioned, young people and women are really feeling the brunt and will continue to feel the brunt of this pandemic. So organizing, coordinating the ecosystem and bringing forward those requests and those challenges in a way that maximizes the impact and benefit to providers is really one of our key concerns.
Sarah, I guess I'm going to bounce back up to you, because this issue of access to the internet, access to the kinds of I guess modern tools that we need in workforce development and education, is that an issue for the Polytechnics? Is that something that you all worry about?
Well, I don't know if the recognition was there before. It certainly was after students were sent off campus. I think that's when we really started recognizing not only the absolute requirement for those facilities and equipment that was available to them on campus, but even the Wi-Fi that was available to them, and how much they really relied on that. How many students were using school equipment, school computers in the library, and really counting on those services and that support in order to study and in order to complete their training. So then you move those students that are highly tactile learners to begin with, you move them off campus. And you say, okay, so we're going to do this online. And there was a huge need for technology loaners. As one of the things I thought was really interesting was how often it came up that faculty, they didn't have the things that they needed in order to deliver the training remotely, whether or not that was computers or that was the broadband internet. They did not have the ability to do that in a way that was really high quality. Now, everybody, I think, did the best they could do with the environment, but there were huge requirements for loaners and supports, and even, all of our member institutions have set up emergency student assistance, where they are providing domestic students, international students across the board with money that was for living expenses, was for food, was for technology, was for internet service. So, you think that, oh, everybody's got a smartphone, everybody's got a laptop. That is not true, and it does leave people behind when you're in this kind of situation.
I really appreciate you mentioning that, and we have a number of people who are commenting about the tactile learning. And Jake knows this very well because he's tried to teach me to go out to LinkedIn Learning and to YouTube, and he knows that I have got to, like, I can read it, I can see it, I got to touch it, feel it, and fail. And somehow my fingers, my hands don't learn just because I'm reading or I'm seeing. I've got to experience that. Trudy, we're talking about broadband, and I wanted to ask you, traditionally when we thought of infrastructure, we thought of, roads and bridges and water and sewer. Has broadband risen to the point where it's part of that infrastructure conversation? As you're working with economic development, is there a recognition of how critical that is?
Absolutely, Ron, and we're seeing it become a top priority in many communities across the country. That recognition that accessibility to the internet, to the information, to these platforms is, super critical to communities, both in attracting and retaining talent, in supporting the education systems, and in supporting business expansion and retention and business growth. So it's a key recognition. We're starting to see investments happening literally across the country. And so I just want to not lose sight of one thought that's kind of risen for me as we've been having this conversation. And that is that there is a large percentage of those that have been impacted through layoffs that are not connected to post-secondary, that are not part of any employment support agency. They're not a client, they're not registered as a client. What about those people? What are they going to do? And to Stephen's point, many of them are perhaps, they've been employed in lower skilled occupations, or, we know that there are marginalized populations. And it worries me to think about, how those individuals are going to re-enter the workforce, and how are we going to support them to, improve their computer literacy, to improve their ability to use technology. Because I think no matter what occupation you go back into, there has been an impact of technology on that occupation. And how are we supporting, how communities strategize about supporting those individuals to make it back into the workforce?
So if I was going to ask you to your advice on, if we want to build a more resilient workforce development system, a pan-Canadian, but really in our province and our local area, what's the first step? What's your first step suggesting to the people who have joined us today?
Well, I'm going to suggest that we have to keep the conversation going. We've got many brains with many great ideas. Looking at the chat room here is phenomenal. The chat is amazing. And so number one, we need to keep the conversation moving. But number two, we need to make sure that we're being responsive. We need today, first and foremost. So what's the data? Who can we talk to that's going to help us understand what's happening in my community?
That's Stephen. Gladys, we'll do a quick round. What's the thing that you're saying to youth serving organizations? What's the first thing they got to do?
Get organized. So we're pulling everybody together. We're starting to talk about what we as an ecosystem and a sector need. What do our staff need? What do our management need in order to be able to be ready to support post-pandemic efforts, and get organized in our request and engagement with government at all levels to make sure that they are equipped to be able to be part of that recovery effort.
And how do I get into the circle of organizations that talk to you?
You simply send us a message at info@CCYP, or you follow us on LinkedIn, CCYP too,
Great. What
to stay connected to us. Can I just add one more thing though, Ron, before you move on to your rapid round? Just want to follow from what Trudy was saying in terms of what's the first thing that we need to start working on collectively across the country. And I would say that it's to acknowledge that we do not have a national workforce development strategy.
Yay.
We have employment programming. You might like that, Trudy. we have employment services and employment policies across the country that are not necessarily designed to complement or advance economic development. And we really, really need to think long and hard about that, which is why the word and even having an organization like Workforce Central and CCYP thinking about workforce development is so critical. But I think that is our fundamental shift right now. That simple, quick labor market attachment, quick employment in bums and seats jobs is not it. It's not sufficient anymore. And we really need to think broader about that continuum of services in the workforce development realm. Okay, I'll let you go back to your rapid.
What's the first thing you're going to suggest to folks that they need to do, they need to think about?
Yes.
You know, I think that I mean, I would build on what Trudy had to say in terms of, you know, the workforce is going to be in flux, and we're going to have to figure out upskilling, reskilling, continuous learning. We've talked about lifelong learning in this space for so incredibly long, and we just have not figured out a way to create lifelong learners and then serve those lifelong learners with the things that they need. And I think that that's a place where we've got to put a lot more time and attention.
What a great segue. Jake, hey, what keeps you up at night? What do you think the first thing people that are tuned in today, what do they need to be thinking about and doing?
So first, kudos to Sarah's members, because honestly, as much as she was describing the struggles that they have in moving online, they have moved online more quickly and more adeptly, I would argue, than any of the other post-secondaries across Canada as a group. And they've also mastered work-integrated learning to a much greater extent than the vast majority of post-secondaries. And if you think of what's at the core of those two things, it's the two sets of skills I talked about earlier. The human skills required in order to become a nurse or in order to become a technician, but the human skills that actually require watching another human to ensure that they have those skills, and the technical or digital literacy skills to move online. And so a quick tip in respect to both, we have 4 free courses, free actual learning pathways made up of, in some cases, over a dozen courses on how to teach online, how to work from a remote location, how to apply for a job from a remote location. And so I'd highly recommend folks make themselves aware at least of those LinkedIn Learning courses that are available for free. And I couldn't agree more with what Trudy and Gladys were saying about both the ecosystem as a whole having to work together. That includes economic and workforce development, higher education and government, et cetera. And we see ourselves trying to facilitate that. So if we can help in any way, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you. And Stephen, I want to ask you as we close out here, what numbers are you going to watch? What could we be watching to see, like, to gauge where we are?
Yeah, I mean, I think first, the impact of the crisis is still unfolding, and we have to kind of keep our sort of temperature check on that. But, when I think about this conversation and thinking, as premature as it might be to be thinking about a recovery, I think we need to be a little bit more precise in terms of where new opportunities will emerge, because there'll be different ones emerging in different places and different sectors. What will those opportunities be? Where will they be? And what training might be required, right? And I think having that insight will enable this conversation to actually turn into something more meaningful in terms of action. And if anything, that action has to be directed towards the people that we're seeing that are being most affected by the crisis, so they can re-participate in whatever recovery we're able to offer. So better information on where the insights will be and what they're like. Otherwise, it's just a conversation. We need to turn it into concrete action.
And thanks for what you do with the numbers. I follow that. I'm Ron Painter. It's been my pleasure to hang out with a smart panel. We're going to be hanging out after we leave you. We're going to spend some more time together trying to get to some of the comments that we saw and some of the questions. If you have a question and you want to learn more, ask us at Workforce Central Canada. Ask at workforcecentralcanada.ca. Again, that's ask at workforcecentralcanada.ca. And Jake, we're going to get some information up on Workforce Central about how people can access those courses. So on behalf of NAWB Incorporated, MDB Insight, and HIAC, I'm Ron Painter saying thank you, and I hope we continue and you join us for the conversation to follow.
Thank you.